Welcome to Miss Smith's Math Tutorials. I'm Miss Smith. In this video, we're going to be talking about graphing sine and cosine. Our sine and cosine equations will look like y equals, and then there will be a plus or minus. The a will be the amplitude. We'll talk about what that means in just a second. And then it could be sine or cosine. It's not both. I know it's written kind of weird here, but it just means it could be a positive sine or a negative sine. Or it could be a positive cosine or a negative cosine. This symbol means theta, and in our examples it's just going to stay theta. And then plus d, and d stands for the midline. So it's just where is the middle of the picture that we're creating. When we graph sine and cosine, we're going to use 5 key points. And these key points are going to be radians that are from the unit circle. So the key points are going to be 0, pi over 2, pi, 3 pi over 2, and 2 pi. And that might feel really random, like why are we using radians? But these radians come from the unit circle. And so I've drawn just a little picture of the unit circle here. So 0 would be right here. Pi over 2 would be right here. Pi would be over here. 3 pi over 2 would be down here. And we would come back around to 2 pi right here. So what we're doing is we're looking at one circle, one time around the circle, and we're going to be creating one period of each graph. Right up front, I want to say that this video is not going to cover period changes or phase shifts. We're going to just keep it really simple in this video, so if you're looking for something more advanced like that, then this is probably not the video for you. We'll see this as we get into some examples, but if we have a positive sign, meaning there's not a symbol out here, which is just assume positive, and it's a sign written, we would always start at the midline, then go to the max. If it's a negative sign, we start at the midline, and then we'd move to min. That'll make more sense once we actually get into some examples. The pattern for cosine, if it's a positive cosine, we start at the max, and if it's a negative cosine, we start at the min. So that's, if you can just kind of memorize, there's 3 things here that you really want to memorize that'll help you moving forward with these problems. In this first one, we have y equals sine of theta. So that looks pretty plain compared to this up here. And what we want to do at the beginning is designate what is our d value. What is that? Notice that little plus d out here, which is our midline. And you might be thinking, well, there's nothing after the theta. There is no midline. Well, there is. It's just that they haven't written it. So if you don't see anything out here, that means it is plus 0. And so that means our midline is just, our d is just 0. When we want to know the amplitude, remember that's our a, that's our value right in front of either the sine or the cosine. So when I look here and I look out front, notice there's nothing there. Well, there is something there. It's an understood 1. So you can write that in if you want to. So that means our amplitude is 1. Now when they ask for the pattern, what we're asking is, which of these is it? Is it positive sine, positive cosine, or negative cosine? So when I look at this, I don't see any sign there, which means it's positive, and it's sine. So this is and I'm just going to write sine. You could do a plus sign if you want, but I'm just going to write sine. So the pattern tells us how we start this graph that we're going to create. To find the max, we just add d plus a. So whatever our d was plus our a. So in this case, that's a 0 plus 1. And 0 plus 1 is just 1. So that means our max is 1. And to find our min of our graph, we take our d and subtract a. So d again is 0 and a is 1, so we say 0 minus 1. So our minimum of our graph would be -1. So now we're going to take each of these components and actually use them to create a graph picture of this equation. So when we have sine or cosine, we're creating almost like these like sound wave looking curves. And so when we do that, it is going to repeat, but we're going to be only creating one period. We're only going to be using these 5 points to create one section of this graph. Let's go ahead and label the different parts of our x-axis using our 5 key points. So at the origin, we're always going to have 0. And then I'm going to just skip 3 just to create some space. You could go to the next one, but then it's going to be really cramped. So I'm going to skip 3 lines. So 1, 2, 3, and then I'm going to use my next key point, pi over 2. And I'm going to skip 3 lines again and go to my next key point, which would be pi. Skip 3 again and go to 3 pi over 2. Skip 3 again, and I'm going to go to 2 pi. So notice I've got each of my 5 key points laid out and spaced out nicely. The next thing I want to do is I want to label my midline, my max line, and my min line, and I'm going to do that in a different color. So my midline, notice, was at 0, right? So I'm going to go to 0 on my y-axis, and I'm going to lay down my midline, and I'm going to just kind of trace over in a different color. Okay, so you can see I've traced my midline. Now you can't really see it because I'm drawing over that line, but I've labeled it over here that my midline is the same as the axis line because it fell at 0 on the y-axis. So now I want to think about, okay, what are my max and what are my min? Well, my max fell at +1. That means the highest my graph is going to go is +1. And my min fell at -1. That means the lowest my graph is going to go is -1. When I create this graph, I could say, okay, that's 0, so I'm going to make that 1. I'd rather not do that because that's going to create a really small graph, and I want you to get a nice big picture. So I'm going to create some distance. I'm going to make this first little tick mark be 0.5. I'm going to make it half. And then the next tick mark I'll make +1. And then the same thing the other direction. This first tick mark I'm going to make -1/2. And then the lowest one I'm going to make -1. And that just kind of creates some distance there. I've got my midline. I want to trace what is my max line and what is my min line. And that's just going to help me keep my graph organized. Okay, so I've got both my max line and my min line laid out, and that just gives me the parameters for how high and how low my graph should go. Now I'm going to focus on what the pattern was. So remember, the pattern we said was positive sine. So positive sine, you're going to plot your first point at the midline. So my first point will fall at 0, and I'm going to plot that point at the midline right here. So it says it starts at midline, then max. So because it's positive sine, I'm going to be going up. Now I'm not going to go up right here, right? Because that isn't my next point. My next point is actually here. And again, I've done this to kind of create some distance. So my next point over here at pi2 is going to be at the max. And I'll plot that point. So now you might be thinking, okay, where do I go from here? So once you get that starter, the mid, and then the max, you can then follow the pattern in a curved way. So the sine and the cosine graphs are always going to follow this, like I said, the sound wave type curve. So you can follow that pattern. So we go from mid to max. We're going to go back to mid for the next point, pi. Then for 3 pi over 2, we've created this pattern up, and now we're going to go down with it. So we're going to go to our min line. And then the next place that it makes sense we would go to would be the midline again. So you see, mine's not perfect by any means, but you can see that nice curve, that nice flow from one point to the next. And again, this is one period of this equation. And what's important to note is that period technically would continue, right? It would just start again. So we're starting at the mid, we're going up and then down and then to the mid again, and then we would just keep going, right? If you wanted to do another period, you would go up to the max and then down, and it would continue on. So this technically continues, right? And it would keep going and it would then go down. But this is just one period of it. So you might be thinking, we use the midline, right? We use that to create that middle line. We use the max for that. We use the min for that. We use the pattern, right, for our positive sign that told us what place to go next, where to start and where to go next. And you might be wondering, what is amplitude? Because we didn't really talk about that a ton. All amplitude is letting you know how many units up or down you move from the midline. So notice this was our midline, right? And from here to here was our max, and from here to here was our min. So all the amplitude being 1 is saying is that from the midline to the max, that is 1 unit. That has an amplitude of 1. And in the same way, it's 1 unit to the min. And I know some people are probably thinking, well, but it's 2 boxes. How is it 1 unit? Remember that we made 1 box for a half mark just to create a bigger picture, right? Technically, from here to here is 1 unit, because that would be the positive 1. Okay, let's look at our second example. So this says y equals cosine of theta. So very similar to this one in that we don't have a lot going on either side of the cosine. So let's go ahead and fill in what we know is there. So our plus d, there's nothing there, so that means it has to be plus 0. That would make our midline, our d, 0. Our amplitude A out front, again, there's nothing there. So in that case, it's an understood coefficient of positive 1. So our amplitude is 1. Our pattern, there's no sign out here, so that means it's positive. So positive cosine. So I'm just going to put cosine. So that means we're going to be following that pattern right there. Starts at the max. Now to actually find the max, remember we take our d plus a. So in this case, 0 plus 1. And that gives us a max of positive 1. And for our min, d minus a, so 0 minus 1, gives us a min of negative 1. So at this point, we can go ahead and fill out the framework of our graph. We can go ahead and add our 5 key points. We can figure out, okay, again, very similar to this one, my max is 1. I want a little more space than that, so I'm again going to make that 1/2, and that 1, and this negative 1/2, and that negative 1. So now I can go ahead and add my midline at 0, so it's just going to be this line right here, my max line at positive 1, and my min line at negative 1. Okay, now that we have our framework laid out, we can finally graph this. When we look at our pattern, remember it was positive cosine. So positive cosine says our first point starts at max. So instead of starting here at the origin like I did over here, I'm going to start up here at my max line. Now it would naturally follow, if I'm going to follow this same wave pattern, right, that if I'm starting at the max, well, my next natural place for my next point is at the mid. And then my next natural place would be the min line, right there for pi. And then back to the mid. And then finally at the max again for 2 pi. You're just following the wavelength. Now you want to connect your points, and you want to do so with a nice soft curve as you go. So there you have one period of this equation, and it would continue on much like this one, like if you want to add the little dot dot dot, because it would keep going in that direction and continue the wavelength. And again, notice our amplitude was 1 for this one as well, which makes sense because from our midline to our max, it is 1 unit in either direction. Okay, let's look at some more examples. So for this one, we have y equals 2 sine of theta. So this time we have a positive 2 thrown out front. And again, we don't have anything here in the place of d, so that means it's still plus 0. So that means our d, our midline, is 0. Our amplitude a, remember that's in front of the pattern, the sine, and in this case it's a 2. And that 2 is positive, so that means this is a positive sine pattern, so I'm just going to write the pattern as sine. Now I know we don't have it on this page, but on the other page, remember that the pattern for positive sine is we start at the midline and then we go to max. Now to find the max, we take our d and add our a, so in this case it's going to be a 0 plus 2, which would give us a positive 2 for our max. And for our min, d minus a, so 0 minus 2, gives us a negative 2 for our min. So now that I've got all my information, I'm ready to lay out the framework for my graph. I can go ahead and add my 5 key points to the x-axis, and to my y-axis, notice that this time my max is 2 and my min is negative 2. So I'm going to go ahead and make this a positive 1 and this a positive 2, and I'm going to make this a negative 1 and a negative 2. I'm going to go ahead and create my midline, which in this case is again 0, my max line, which is going to fall at positive 2, and my min line, which is going to fall at negative 2. Okay, now we're ready to actually graph the pattern. So remember, positive sign, we're going to start at the midline, so right here in this blue midline. Going to plot our first point, and then we go to max. So for my pi over 2, now I'm going to be up here at the max. Now from here, I just follow the wave pattern. So that would be to mid, to min, and to mid. And then you want to connect the dots. There is our 1 period for this equation, and also note the amplitude is 2, which makes sense because it is 2 units from the midline in either direction. And it's good to note that this would continue on if you were to continue the pattern. In this next example, we have y equals negative 3 cosine of theta plus 1. So hopefully you're noticing this is the first time we haven't had a plus 0. We actually have a different midline here. Our d here is a positive 1. Our amplitude, our a, is a 3. Now I know it's tempting to say, oh, it's negative 3, but here's the thing you've got to understand, and we laid this out on the front page, is that negative isn't really with the 3. The negative is with the cosine. That's going to be our pattern. So our amplitude is 3, and our pattern is negative cosine. Now, if you peek back to the front page, negative cosine pattern starts at min. And then it just continues the wavelength from there. So to find our max, our d plus a, so in this case our 1 plus 3, gives us a max of 4. And our min, d minus a, so 1 minus 3, gives us negative 2. So I'm going to go ahead and lay out the framework of my points, and in this case I'm just going to make each box 1 unit. So this will be 1, 2, 3, 4, and the same in the other direction. Okay, and now I'm going to go ahead and lay out my midline, my max line and my min line. Now notice we got to be really careful here because this is the first time our midline hasn't just been the x-axis, right? This time our midline is a positive 1, meaning I'm going to create my midline here at positive 1. Okay, so now I'm ready to start plotting the points. Remember, our negative cosine pattern starts at the min. That means my first point is going to be all the way down here at -2. Now, my next point, I'm just following the wave pattern from here on out. So if I'm starting down here, it would make sense that my next point would be right here at the midline. Now be careful. We're no longer at the x-axis. Like I said, we're at the midline, and the midline is up here. My next point right here at pi will be at the max. My next point would be back at the midline. And my last point at 2 pi will be at the min. And then you want to go ahead and connect your points. There's our 1 period for our negative cosine. And of course, it would continue on. Notice our amplitude is 3 units. So from our midline, we're 1, 2, 3, and 1, 2, 3. Good way to double check. Okay, for our last example together, we're going to do y equals -4 sine of theta minus 2. So notice our midline, our d, is a -2. Our amplitude A is not a -4, but just a 4. Remember that negative is going to go with the sign. So that's our pattern, negative sign. And remember from the front page that negative sign starts at midline, then goes to min. So our max is our d plus a, so our -2 plus 4, which would give us +2 as a max. And our min, so that would be our -2 minus 4, that's going to give us a minimum of -6. So now I can go ahead and lay out the framework. I'm going to make sure I put each of my points on my x-axis, my 5 key points, but then also I'm going to make each block 1 unit. So I'm going to go all the way up to, I believe it's +6. Now I'm ready to create my midline, max, and min. Notice my midline this time is at -2. It's below the x-axis this time. My max is going to be all the way here at +2, and my min is going to be all the way down here at -6. Okay, notice I have my amplitude of 4 in either direction, so it looks a little weird, but it's 1, 2, 3, 4, and 1, 2, 3, 4. So now remember the pattern. For negative sign, we start at the midline, and then we go to min. So my first point right here will be at the midline. Then we move to min for my next point. Then we move to the midline. So we're going in that wave pattern, then back up all the way to max, and then for 2 pi we'll be at the min. And then you want to go ahead and connect. Okay, so notice we have that nice wavelength in our negative sign pattern. This would continue on as always, but this is 1 period. All right, here's one for you guys to try. I will post the answers for these in the video description below. This has been Miss Math Tutorials.